83b at the bottom. We had just done the Mishnah, and the Mishnah was basically dealing with things that are included in the sale or not included in the sale. And one of the things that we discussed was when the buyer and seller can renege on the deal if it turns out to be a case of of a mistaken sale. Now, the Mishnah was not dealing with what I would call classic ono, which is over or under pricing by more than the sixth, but that's what the Gemara is more interested in. So that's where the Gemara is going to go. Amar of Chisda, the seller sells something, it's worth $5, and he sells it for $6. But then the value goes up. Now it's worth $8. Okay, so now instead of overcharging, it turns out to be a case of undercharging, right? Because he sold at the time of the deal was made, he was overcharging, but now the price of the item changed, so now the agreed price is far below the market price. So Minisana, who is the one who is cheated, the buyer was originally cheated, right? Because at the time, he agreed to pay too much. So because of that, since the original person who was cheated was the buyer, it's the buyer who can back out of the deal, not the seller. Mishum, because the buyer can say, Ilu lo anisan, if you hadn't cheated me in the first place, then you wouldn't have been able to change your mind, because the sale would have been final. It's like the assumption here is that because there was overcharging, the deal was never finalized, or legally the deal never was completed, never took place. Okay, so the buyer can say, look, if you hadn't cheated me, if you had charged me the right price, we would be done, right? So any change in the price would not have been a factor in our sale, because the sale would have already been completed. Now that you cheated me, the fact that you cheated me, does that mean that you should get more rights? That doesn't seem right, right? So therefore, we don't allow the seller in this case to renege. The Amar of Chisda also says, what's interesting to me here is, I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder, until when is the sale not finalized, right? 3 years later, can the guy sue and say, oh, you overcharged me 3 years ago? Not a question of suing, but can we say that the deal was never valid? That's what it seems like. It doesn't seem like there's any time period, but you can see all kinds of problems with that. Of course, the price is going to change, over time.
Prices change all the time. If you buy toilet paper for $1 today, and then
could be $2 next week.
A week later, it's either 50 cents or it's $5. What?
Right.
So there's ain't a davar sof,
right? So I'm wondering, is there any kind of time? Obviously, if it's a valid deal and there's no cheating, so then the sale is a sale. Price changes later. There's nothing to do with the transaction, right? As you say, prices change all the time, right? But this seems to be a case of an open-ended thing. Well, actually, so the Gemara actually rejects that and says, you know what? For a different reason, it's not an open-ended thing. The seller cannot come back later and say, oh, the price is now so high that I undercharged you. He can't do that, because now, the Gemara is not saying, not because there's a statute of limitations, but because, it's your own fault that the deal never is still open, that the deal never closed. It's your own fault because you tried to overcharge. Okay, but we have a brisa that accords with this. Excuse me. Yafos v'nimtzu ros. If you sell something and you purport it to be good quality, it turns out to be poor quality, then the buyer can renege on the deal, but not the seller. And we're understanding this to be that even if the price has changed, but it's only the buyer who can the one who was cheated, who can renege, who can cancel the deal. The Amar of Chisda said, if you have something that's worth $6, you sell it for $5. V'huslu, and then it got cheaper. V'yamdol shlosha, and now it's only worth $3. Minasana, who's the guy that got the losing out here? Mocher. It's the it's the seller, right? He sold it for too low a price, and the buyer cheated him essentially. Therefore, Mocher Yachalachserbo, the seller can renege. Like even if he was willing to let it go for $5, and if it goes down to 3, he can change his mind
Yeah,
because
but-
legally he was the deal never closed because he had been cheated.
well, I don't know. If a person has a fire sale and he wants to call his a liquidation sale, and
Mhm.
normally he would sell it for 10. Now he's selling for 5. He's selling for 3. Well, how can he come back and say to all his customers, no, I really should have sold it to you for more?
Because the idea of oh no of cheating goes both ways, right? Neither the buyer nor the seller can take advantage by over or underpricing by more than 1/6. Applies to both, even if they agreed to it, right? That's the point, right? Like, you can imagine where, people, either buyers or sellers are under external pressures, right? The seller needs the money desperately, the buyer needs the item desperately, right? And so he's even willing to overpay or underpay or undercharge. But the rule is it's not a valid transaction. You have to take a reasonable profit and not too much more.
Well, how do you account for competition then? The gas wars. Let's say the gas station charges $3.99, and then he sees his competitor charging $3.79, and he charges $3.59. They compete
Mhm.
because they're willing to they know what their profit is, and they're willing to decrease their prices to a certain point. And this goes on all the time across the street. They know someone selling or buying for less. They'll compete with their
So
competitors.
the interesting wrinkle you bring in is that like what is the market price, right? So the case that you're discussing is the market price is changing because of these competitive issues, right? These competitive factors. So it's an interesting case, right? Like how do you know what the value or what the market price is where the prices are so volatile? That's a great question. I
Right.
don't know the answer. Okay, but in a state, I think we can safely say that in a stable market, look, these are the rules about price gouging, right? That if and this is in I think in American law also, right? That there are cases where and this is not what Kamala Harris was talking about, by the way. Price gouging technically is where you're taking advantage of outside factors such as natural disasters, or exigent circumstances that put the buyers at a disadvantage. The seller is not allowed to overcharge, not allowed to jack up the price due to those exigent circumstances.
That's right.
Right. Right. So that's essentially what we're talking about. When you throw in things like the market price is very volatile and it's hard to establish what it is, well, obviously that's a complicating factor. Okay, so I don't know the answer to your question, but it may be that you can't really determine what Onoa is under those circumstances because there is no set value or value that you can say this is the market price.
Hmm.
Um, um,
Damarle.
um,
Damarle.
yeah, 1 second. So where was I? So let's go back. Amar, if you sell something that's worth $6, $5 for whose the value goes down. Meaning Nisana, who got cheated? Mocher, the seller. Mocher so only the seller can then renege, not the buyer. Because he could say, Ilu lo Nisan, if you hadn't underpaid me initially, lo havamasi sandrabach, you couldn't have changed, then the deal would have closed and we'd have nothing more to do with each other. There would be no opportunity for you to renege. So now that because you've cheated me, you're gonna say you're gonna change your mind. No way. But Tana Tuna, and we have a supporting Tana. Rose to Yafos, same idea. If somebody is selling you're selling something that you're saying is not good, and then it turns out to be good quality. The buyer, sorry, the seller can is the one who can retract and not the buyer. Michael Marshall. So what's Rav Chisda telling us? Like this should be opposite. Masnisin here. It's exactly in our Mishnah. Like what is he adding by by this case of selling for 6 and the 6 and 5 case. Even Masnisin, because from the Mishnah of Amina Dilma or Rav Chisda, Travayu Masa Hadrabu. But maybe in the Rav Chisda's case, maybe both of them could still renege. Umasnisin ha'az lashmiyan, and what's the Mishnah talking about? The lokeach yachad lachzerba, the buyer can change his mind. The salkadat chamina, and this is the case of the good quality and the poor quality, because salkadat chamina might have said mishum dichsiv ra ra yomar hakana. The pasuk says in Mishlei that essentially what the Gemara's understanding here is that the buyer is always saying when negotiating, the buyer is saying, "Oh, this garbage. You want me to pay so much money for this poor quality stuff, right?" So, in other words, it's understood that people will make claims during the negotiations that you don't take so seriously, right? If the buyer says, "Oh, this stuff is really no good," right? Don't take him seriously that he really believes that. Everybody understands this is whatever quality it is, and you're just trying to to work out everybody's trying to work out an advantage in the negotiations. So Rav Chisda comes along and tells you that specifically that only the buyer or only the seller, only the one who was cheated in the first place has the opportunity to retract. Okay, next thing in the Mishnah, Shechamtis v'nimtzeis levana. The Mishnah discussed cases where you're selling one thing and you're purporting to sell one thing, turns out to be another thing. For example, red wheat and white wheat, right? There's these two kinds of wheat, and I say I'm selling you red wheat, and you buy it, and it turns out when you accept delivery, it's not red wheat at all, it's white wheat. So the Mishnah says those are different things. That's a mekach, right? That's like I was selling you selling you barley and not wheat, right? That wasn't our deal, so the deal is not valid. So side point, a little tangent here, Amarav Papa, Midiktani Levana, since we call this one kind of wheat Levana, white, Shmamina Hashimsha Sumakti, we can deduce that the sun is red. Okay, what does that mean? Teda, the Kasamkad Safra Upanya, and so first of all, what does he mean by saying this? It's like because the word that they use for red is shachamtis, right? Which has the root in it, chama, the sun, right? So if the other kind of wheat is white and the shachamtis is called red, so it must be that the sun, it's indicating that the sun is red, okay? And not only that, Teva, another indication that we know the sun is red, the Kasamkot Safropanya, because if you look at the sun at sunrise and sunset, the sun looks more red. What about the rest of the day? It looks white or it looks yellow or whatever color, not red. Why doesn't it look red the rest of the day? No, because it's so bright, it's affecting your vision. You can't really tell what color it is. You can't get a good look at it or whatever. So in the morning and evening, it's easier to look at the sun, and what do you know? It's red in the morning and the evening. Not always true, by the way, but various atmospheric conditions. But when it doesn't look red, it's because your vision is distorted by the brightness of the sun. Meisveis, the Gemara says, really, it's the sun red. Umareo amok minar. The Torah says when it talks about saras that this lesion appears deeper than the skin, right? And it's talking about and it says, what does that mean? Kamari chama. It's similar to the way, the perception of a sunlit area looks deeper somehow than the shaded area. Okay, so I'm not even sure what that's supposed to mean, but let's just take it as written. Now the lesion that we're talking about is a white lesion, right? So you're saying the white lesion looks deeper than the skin, just like the sun looks deeper than the shade, right? So doesn't that indicate that the sun's white? So my answer is Kamari Chama below Kamari Chama. Not necessarily. It's two different aspects here. Kamari Chama Damuka Min Etzel. It looks like the sun in the sense that it looks deeper than the shade, right? So too, the white lesion looks deeper than the skin around it. But we're not talking about its color. We're talking about its depth. The sun indeed could be red, and this lesion is white, and that's not saying that they're the same color. It's just saying the depth perception is similar. But according to what you first wanted to say, that this proves that it's white, that the sun is white, like, if it's white, why does it look red in the morning and the evening? Like the other way around, we had a theory, right, that really it's red and it looks white in the middle of the day because your vision is affected by the brightness, or your color perception is affected by the brightness. But if you want to say it's really white, then why does it look red in the morning and evenings? The answer is bit safra in the morning, the chalfa abe varde de Gan Eden, because it's going through Gan Eden, which is understood to be in the east, right? So there's the red roses in Gan Eden that give it that color, right? And so really it's white, but it takes on a red shade because it's passing through Gan Eden. And Bapanya in the evening, the chalfa pischa de Gehenna. In the west is Gehenna. The fires of Gehenna are making the sun look red when it's in the west. But really, the Havamina was really the sun might be white and it looks red in the morning and evening because of the regions it's passing through. Vikanari, or some say the opposite, that the Gehenna is in the east and Gehenna is in the west, whatever. Either way, that's how you would explain if the sun were white, that's how you explain why it looks red in the morning and the evening. But really, we conclude that the sun is red, and it only looks white during the day because it's so bright. Okay, done with that. The Mishnah said, if you sell one thing, you sell something and it's purported to be wine, but it turns out to be vinegar, then that's a mekach tos, and you can either party can renege. Maybe this is like Rabbi and not the rabbis. Tanya. The Mishnah says wine and vinegar is considered to be the same type of thing, right? It's two ends of a spectrum, you might say, right? It's a fermented grape product, right? Sometimes it's spoiled and vinegary, and sometimes it's good and it's wine. Okay, but it's really the same kind of thing. Rabbi Omer Shnei Minim. Rabbi says no, they're considered two different things. This fermented grapes is wine, and another kind of fermented grapes is vinegar. You can't say they're on a spectrum. So it appears that our Mishnah is saying that they're two separate things, right? Maybe that supports Rabbi. Or it says no, afilu rabbanan. Even the rabbis might agree with our Mishnah. Adklan pli rabbanan alei de Rabbi. When do the rabbis dispute Rabbi and say that it's all part of one spectrum? Elinu maser truma. That's when it comes to taking maser and truma, right? That's what they're talking about. So if you have a big crop, or a big production facility full of fermented grape product, and some of it has spoiled and become vinegar, you can use that. Can you use that for truma and maser, right? Like, you don't want to give away your valuable stuff for truma and maser. You give away the spoiled stuff, right? So can you say that is valid? So the rabbis say that minachadu, that yes, it's all part of a spectrum. You want to give the less valuable stuff, you can, technically you can do that. And the rabbi says no. Rabbi Law, and the rabbis hold like Rabbi Law, Rabbi Law. How do you know that if you use the poor quality stuff for truma, that is valid? Because the Torah says, Torah says, don't sin when you give your truma. So if it doesn't even work, right? If you're giving this to the coin, but it doesn't count as truma, then there's no sin involved, right? You haven't given truma, it's true, but there's no sin in giving truma because it doesn't count as truma. So it must be that it counts as truma. Mikan l'tormin arol yafash truma, so truma must be that it counts as truma, but you did wrong, right? You did something that's unethical or not the best way to do it. Avalina mekach
But
memka.
it is truma, right? Don't we
Yeah,
say that does count as
yeah.
truma?
It is. It works. In other words, it's a spectrum, right? It's all one big crop. You can give from the poor quality, which is vinegar, which we call vinegar, as your truma. But when it comes to buying and selling, the kuli alma, it's understood when buying and selling. Sometimes I want to buy vinegar, right? Sometimes I want to buy wine. Right? It's not the question of whether one is better or one or worse, right? The question is, what is it that I'm buying? If I wanted to buy vinegar and you gave me wine, that's a mekach tos. That's a that's a not a valid transaction. So you could so it's not a question of better or worse, and that's why in the case of our Mishnah, the author of our Mishnah could indeed say, with regard to truma, they're on a spectrum, but when it regards commercial transactions, you have to sell what you say you're selling. Okay. Next Mishnah. Hamocher peros
Why would there be a
l'chavero.
havamina that he would be that there would be a chet here? If you even if you with regarding truma, why would there even be the havamina? If we
By
say, but
it's not technically a chait in the sense. I think it means it's not technically a chait in the sense that you're committing an avera, right? But it is you are behaving in a way that doesn't give the Kohen his due, right? You're supposed to give truma to the Kohen. You're giving him the garbage, right? It's not right. Okay, in other words, it counts technically. It counts as truma. Technically, you did the mitzvah, but you did something that's not that's not right. That makes sense?
okay, so it does. It's even though it doesn't look good, it still counts.
Yeah, exactly. Next Mishnah, Hamocher peros l'chavero. You sell fruit. Mashach v'lo mardan. So if the buyer did Mashicha, but he hadn't measured it yet, right? So you say, I'm buying, 10 pounds of apples, and then you start taking the apple, you take the apples, but you haven't weighed it yet. Okay. So kana, you've acquired it, right? You did Mashicha, that works. And then obviously you're entitled to 10 pounds, but you've already done the kinyan on those 10 pounds. But if it's been measured, but he didn't take it yet, lo kana, so the transaction is not complete. Because the measuring doesn't do a kinyan, right? The measuring, presumably the seller is doing the measuring. If there's no kinyan affected yet, then the transaction is not yet complete. And so the practical application is, if you change your mind, you haven't completed the transaction yet. And if you're smart, if you're the buyer is smart, what you can do is rent the location of the produce. Now we're not talking about 10 pounds of apples, we're talking about a silo of wheat, right? So if you rent the silo from the buyer, now it's your property. And so you've done the kinyan. So as soon as you've agreed on the price and handed over the money, the kinyan is effective because it's on the buyer's property. If you buy flax, you have to move it from one place to another. That's when the kinyan takes effect and the transaction is complete. But if it is still growing in the ground, the talash kalshu, then if you harvest a little bit, you pick a little bit of it, then that's how you acquire it. And the Gemara will explain how that works. Rav Asi says, madad, if you measured it, and you put it on the floor of the simta. Now remember, a simta is like technically Rishus Harabim, but it is a place that's set aside for for like these transactions, right? It's not the main street. You've got a little alcove which is designated for people to do business, right? To exchange goods or whatever. So once you put it, so since it's designated for that, once you put it on that simta on the floor there, kana, then the kinyan takes place. Amar Zera Lavasi Shema Lo Shama Rebbe. Maybe you hadn't maybe you didn't, you hadn't heard, what, maybe you only heard this when the buyer has his own container, right? But if it's on the floor, I don't think Rabbi Yochanan really said that, right? The simta wouldn't be kana. Amalei, so Rasi answered, "Dami Hamarabban Deloka Gamri Inche Shmata." You call yourself a rabbi. I don't think you ever learned anything in your life. It makes no sense. Like, what do you need to tell me? Like, why would Rabbi Yochanan have to tell me that if the seller puts the goods into the buyer's shopping bag, of course the buyer is kana, right? Like, we don't need Rabbi Yochanan to tell us that. The fact that he's telling us something is he's telling us about it must be telling us about putting it on the floor of the simta. So now the Gemara says, "Kibul minei, lo kibul minei." What did Reb Zera say after that? Did he accept that rebuke, or did he accept that interpretation, or not? Tashma, let's figure it out. Yom Rav Yanai Amar Rabbi Yanai. Rabbi Yanai said in the name of Rabbi Yanai, and it's important to know that Rabbi Yanai was Rabbi Yochanan's teacher, so we're going to assume that whatever Rabbi Yochanan said accorded with Rabbi Yanai. If you have a chatzar that's owned by two people, then each one can acquire something from the other, like by virtue of his share in the ownership of it, right? My level karka. So aren't we talking about on the ground, right? And so that would be that would indicate that the simta would be the same thing. Whereas this no, Rabbi Yanai might be talking about into the buyer's shopping bag. And this actually makes sense. If you, he says explicitly, if you measure something and put it on the simta, on the floor of the simta, lo kana. There's no acquisition there. There's no kinyan. So kashana dade. So don't they? So doesn't that contradict Rav Yanai? What's quoted from Rav Yanai or was quoted from Rav Yochanan? The only way you can resolve this apparent contradiction is one of them is talking about when you put it into the buyer's shopping bag, then he is kana. When you put it onto the floor of the simta, he's not kana. Shmamina. Okay, so that's so Rabbi Zera could be following that path, and that's why he understood Rabbi Yochanan as saying on the floor of the into the buyer's container. Okay.
So how do they resolve? How do they resolve the kashan adadi? Isn't it? Are they?
No, so we
what are
take
the two?
the kashan adade because they're talking about two different cases, right? One case is into the bag of the buyer, then he is kana. Then
Right.
both members would agree that he's kana, and the
Right.
other is on the floor of the simta. They would agree he's not kana.
Oh,
Right. So the one that says he's kana refers to the case of the shopping bag. The one that says he's not kana refers to the case of the simta, and they both have the same. They're both consistent that way,
so
right?
both.
They both would agree with both cases, right? So the fact that there's a different outcome in the two cases is not because they disagree; it's because the two cases are different circumstances.
Both from Rabbi Yochanan.
And they're both from Rabbi Yochanan or Rabbi Yanai, who we assume hold the same opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so Tashma. Let's continue to try and improve this out. Madad v'lo mashach. Our Mishnah said, what if you measured and didn't do Mashicha? Lokana. You don't acquire it. Ma'alav b'simta. So what case are we talking about? I'm going to assume that we're talking about on the floor of the simta, right? So that is against Ravasi, right? Our Mishnah says lo kana, and Ravasi says kana. So Gemara says lo b'shus rabbi. Our Mishnah is not talking about the simta. It's also talking about a different case. It's talking about the Rishus Rabim, and that's why he's not kana. But the Mishnah could agree with Ravasi that in the simta you are kana, right? But Rishus Rabim is what the Mishnah is talking about, lo kana. That is obvious. So Gemara says, if that's the case, you want to say the Mishnah is talking about about Rishus Harabim, Emaration. Look at the beginning. Mashach v'lo madat. The case where you did Meshicha and it hadn't been measured yet, Kana, you do acquire Meshicha Rishus Harabim Mikanya. Can you be Kana with Meshicha and Rishus Harabim? Vabai v'Rabba Demer Tavayu Mesira Kana Rishus Harabim. Both Abai and Rabba say in Rishus Harabim, how do you do a Kinyan Mesira by taking hold of the handle, taking control of the item, right? Ubachatzer Shena Shel Shnean, and if or either Rishus Harabim or B'Chaser Shena Shel Shneim, a third party's property, right? But Meshicha Kona B'Simta, Meshicha does do a kinyan in a simta, B'Chaser Shel Shneim, or in a shared domain. Lifting it up works anywhere. Okay, but the point is that Abai and Rava both say that Meshicha is Kona in a simta. So how can you say that our Mishnah is talking about a simta where the Mishnah says lo kana, right?
Well,
So our
Rabbi
answer is
Yochanan said it was not kana. Now Rav Asi is saying it is kana in the
no.
Simta.
Ravas. The problem we had with Rav Yochanan is that it's okay to disagree with Rav Yochanan, right? But not if you're Rav Yanai, right? Because there's assumed to have the same opinion. Now our Mishnah, now we're our Mishnah is talking about Madad that talking about Meshicha, and our Mishnah we've just demonstrated must be talking about a Simta, and it says our Mishnah says
The Rav Asi holds that in
Lokana.
Simta it is kana, right?
Our Mishnah says Meshicha. What did our Mishnah say? Lokana, right? Madad v'lo mashach. If you measured, but if you did Meshicha, then it applies. One second. Oh, our Mishnah must be talking about a simta, right? And the Gemara tried to say it's talking about Rishus Harabim, and now we're showing that no, it's talking about a simta. It must be talking about a simta.
But Rav Asi is saying that we hold a Simta is kana, whereas Rav Yochanan said it's not kana, right?
Right. So my mashach nami dekani. So now we're going to understand what does the Mishnah mean when it says that the buyer did Meshicha. Rishus Harabim l'simta. It was in like the Mishnah is talking about Rishus Harabim, right? And when it says Meshicha, it means he pulls it aside from Rishus Harabim into the Simta. So that's how you can parse the Mishnah to say it's partly talking about a Rishus Harabim and partly talking about a Simta. Or is not done. If that's so, Ema Seifa, what about the end of the Mishnah? If you're smart, Socher's Makaman, rent the silo, and then you're kona it right away. Rishus Harabim, Agar. What are you talking about? If the Mishnah is talking about Rishus Harabim, then who are you going to rent it from, right? You can't rent Rishus Harabim. There's no owner. So we must be talking about Rishus Harabim. Our answer is Hachikamar, the Imbrishus Balim, that the last part of the Mishnah we have to read as talking about a different case. If it's not in Rishus Harabim, so the first part of the Mishnah is talking about Rishus Harabim, but if it's not Rishus Harabim, what can you do to protect yourself? And then you rent the silo. Okay, so that's how we can understand our Mishnah as partly in Rishus Harabim and partly not Rishus Harabim, and everything comes out right.
But that's according to Rav Asi that holds that Simta is kana.
Yeah, that's how you would answer according to Ravasi.
But Rav Yochanan would not hold that way.
Yeah, that could be. Okay, that's it for today.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.